Welcome to the fourth ever Primary Source Media live stream. I am Isaac Loftus, the host of Too Complicated for History, and I am joined today by none other than the real Dr. Ben Franklin, and we are here to talk about the portrayal of Dr. Ben Franklin by Michael Douglas in Apple TV's brand new show, Franklin. And today we are talking about episode 4, which is pretty exciting. A lot happened, but the big title, I think of it, is, Franklin in court gets something done. Those are the big headlines of this episode. Doctor, what did you think of this portrayal of the events in this episode?
Good day to you, friends and countrymen. We saw a great deal of ground covered in this episode for all of the blunders of Mr. Douglas's Franklin, all the faux pas, all the embarrassments. We saw it all redeemed in this episode, and the recommitment to the chess master that is Benjamin Franklin in France, did we not? All culminating in the signing of the Treaty of Alliance. So much to unravel and uncover in this episode, including, of course, the final cameo of an equally infamous American, but by no measure as popular as myself. I think we saw in this particular episode the most accurate Mr. Douglas has been to date in the capturing of yours truly, of unearned confidence, of awareness of station, but the recommitment to defy it. Qualities that I think can only encompass American charm.
Interesting.
You understand?
Yeah.
We continue, we've established these various relationships, we've seen the discomfort in the world of court, and just as Dr. Franklin is becoming accustomed to it, accustomed to his popularity, perhaps, and I don't enjoy saying this, perhaps by the end of the episode, slightly too accustomed, we see it interrupted by New England pragmatism, which can undo any party. My friends, if you ever wish for an end to your festivities, if you ever wish for your party to come to a close, invite someone from Massachusetts to start talking.
As someone also from Philadelphia, I know exactly what you're talking about.
And I should offer and extend some congratulations. I have subscribed to several of your modern almanacs, and I understand that your 76ers achieved somewhat of a victory. Am I correct in that in this past week?
They did. I am also still. This is also repping some Philadelphia sports.
We must find you, sir, a shirt with a turkey on it.
Yeah, I think that would be very apt. I will wear it on the show if I'm somehow able to.
You know my opinions upon Eagles, do you not?
I do. But yeah, they're still on the ropes as of last night. But impressive, gutsy win in New York against New York. Philly against New York. The dynamic is very different from your time, Doctor, but Philadelphia very much is the little brother to New York City in that relationship.
See, you were speaking of Philadelphia against New York, and I thought you were returning to the episode and my time because of the victory at Saratoga.
No, not quite.
So it's not so different if you truly look at it.
Not so. But I think you're totally right in sort of the statecraft, seeing his maneuverability and flexibility in working towards his goals in this episode, I think is very evident. And I do want to touch on something before we get into the meat of the episode, because we had a previous episode that flashed to show some action taking place on the American mainland. So in the Battle of Brandywine. And this episode also started with a flashback. And I was curious how you felt about this one in comparison to the other ones, because it still does. This one was Franklin focused, where you get to see you in Parliament, but it does still break that claustrophobia of Passé and Paris and the court that he's trying to maneuver within.
I don't know if it was because the flashback was focused on me, but I didn't mind it as much. Only because of the significance of the moment. And that account of sitting in the King's Privy Council is well documented. Both of those instances in history are fairly well
Sure.
documented. And the outright insults being slung, not only upon me, but upon the American people in that moment before the Prime Minister of Great Britain, was a great embarrassment of mine. And one of the pivotal moments where I realized the schism and separation that Great Britain
Hmm.
viewed the American colonies. I was an advocate for a long time, despite protestations against His Majesty's government, that we were Englishmen. I took great pride in it. In fact, I believe it's in episode one in the brief scene where I am not meeting Eugene,
Right.
that he speaks of the last time I was in the French court as an Englishman,
Hmm.
remarking upon my king to the previous French king and how proud I was of that. And having a disposition to retire in England as a happy scientist and philosopher, I think that moment is pivotal to show the wound and injury that Franklin feels. And I think it will be an essential scene if the series is indeed going to explore and uncover familial ties that become severed
Hmm.
due to what takes place in political alliance and political betrayal. What's important about this, I wear, of course, my a ceremonial um, velvet coat.
Hmm.
You see this coat. Yes, it's remarked through primary accounts that I have a ceremonial coat of velvet. Uh, that I wear that coat. It's remarked upon that I wear that coat. My dear friend, I think Peter Collinson remarks upon it. Even Mr. Bancroft might remark upon it that I'm wearing this coat when I'm meeting with the Privy Council. When I move to sign the Treaty of Alliance, it's regarded I am wearing a velvet coat,
Hmm.
velvet dress coat, and so the show takes that theory, that notion that Franklin wears the same coat that he let himself die an Englishman, uh, to go and truly be born an American,
Hmm.
to do American business and American statecraft. The show leans into that and says it's absolutely the same coat. Um,
Hmm.
so I think for the purposes of the show, it's a wonderful demonstration of showing instead of telling,
Hmm.
and we wouldn't have the same. It would not have the same impact if Franklin simply took out this coat and said, "Did I ever tell you about the time that I love stories, and I'm an old man, so you'll pardon me for any instance to tell a 40-minute story when I could tell a 4 one." But I think it demonstrated well that moment. And I think Mr. Douglas's Franklin captured what the primary accounts say of that moment, that I received this tongue lashing stoically,
Hmm.
with stillness, with statuesque poise. We see that very well in Mr. Douglas's decisions as an actor in that moment. He's still too thin for my liking, and his hair is far too full. But do we not wish people on the stage be of greater aesthetic than we in portrayals of our lives?
They actually remarked upon his hair, interestingly enough, in a scene that had a peculiar item in it. It opens with you playing a funny instrument.
Yes, my invention.
Yeah, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that. The bowl machine.
It is called the Glass Harmonica,
Okay.
and it is an invention that I had commissioned and created while in England in the 17 and 60s, and it became very popular. We
Hmm.
have accounts of it making its way to this side of the Atlantic. Mr. Robert Carter, who was on the Governor's Council, had one commissioned and built and constructed. A very peculiar instrument, and regarded by some to be the most deadly and dangerous instrument to play because of the nature of the thin glass of the structure.
Oh.
So the glass harmonica and the techniques have been around all the way from antiquity. If you have ever taken your finger, wet it with liquid, and run it upon the crystal uh, bump of a glass,
Sure.
you have, in some respects, practiced the art of playing the glass harmonica. The only thing the glass harmonica does is it takes all of those glasses and lines them up in such a way from big to small so as to control the pitch.
Hmm.
And with a pedal system, this cylinder might be turned, the fingers might be wet, the rim of each bump is colored to denote the note, and it might be played.
Hmm.
And in fact, the great musical prodigy Mozart will write a work of music specifically for the glass harmonica, a concerto or sonata, or one of those great works of music will be written specifically for that instrument. It's a very ethereal, very beautiful, very melodious and otherworldly
Huh.
sound.
I never realized that Mozart and Franklin had a collab. That is very cool. But it was an interesting thing to see, even though it very much looked like Michael Douglas was not playing the instrument in the scene. But it sounded nice. How they mix the instrument into the sound design. But I imagine that whatever they had may have been an antique. So it was probably, for the purposes of production, best that he not try to actually play it. But so to get into the meat of it, they you got to meet the king.
Again,
Yeah, again
for the first time.
Yeah,
I had met I had met the previous king.
the previous king. Yes, the new
the first
different
time
king. Yes,
meeting Louis the 16th.
the 16th.
And I say some very, very flattering words. And I was circling back this morning to my diary, determining what was that meeting. And as far as what primary sources survive, it speaks of a very convivial, a very flattering meeting. I know not whether I ever uttered the words saying, if all kings were like you, there would be no republics. That's a very bold and flattering statement. Um, but it had a great deal of ceremony. We see Franklin being offered a ceremonial court sword, which is the symbol of status, the symbol of nobility, the symbol um, of loftiness, and we see Franklin refuse. We see him say no.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that's a wonderful representation of sort of the Republican aspirations of staying a plain, simple man, a humble printer who is standing suddenly before kings. Um, and we see him comport himself well. I think the whole tenor of this episode is Franklin comporting himself well, with the exception of my somewhat drunken blunder at the end, where I find myself entirely filled with a head full of bees. That's one of the slangs I craft for drunkenness, by the way.
A head full of
A
bees.
head full of bees. A
I
head
feel
full
like
of
that's
bees.
more aptly describes what happened the morning after I've drank too much.
You,
That's
depended upon the temperament of the bees.
yeah, right, right. Yeah,
Yes,
that's true.
honeybees or wasps. But then we see the meeting of John Adams. John Adams, who is obviously displeased, but then again, John Adams on his best days seems completely displeased.
Yeah, actually, it was curious to see that and I was actually very, very curious to see him show up at that very moment in just the structure of the narrative that the show is telling. In that, I wish we actually had gotten less of the struggle earlier. I would have rather seen sort of Adams been revealing and picking apart Franklin's. I feel like we've seen some of the downsides, right, and some of the struggles and some of the faults as far as they're constructing them, and missteps in just the previous episode in episode 3, and I thought it might have been more fun to have Adams be the one to sort of pull at that thread and give us that story,
Wow,
because I'm curious
Mr.
how he's going to integrate into this.
So Mr. Adams will be the third agent or minister plenipotentiary
Mm,
to France. We call them ambassador first, but then eventually minister plenipotentiary, meaning bestowed with many powers to represent the business of the United States.
right.
Mr. Adams will succeed significantly better in the Netherlands and even England than he will in France. He will not be popular in France. We will get some wonderful early stories of history where Mr. Adams makes the bold remark that I study war, that my sons might study poetry, etc., etc., etc. A wonderful quote. But Mr. Adams does not play the game. Now,
Yeah.
if anything could be said of a misstep of mine, I play the game slightly too well. And we haven't seen Dr. Franklin play the game very well. We've seen him stumble and blunder and just begin to get acquainted with it when
He
Mr.
does he
Adams
does a
comes
good
in.
job in this episode, I think. There's
He does.
yeah.
I believe he does as well. And so, would it have been better if we had seen Dr. Franklin play it well, a little too well, throughout the business of it, and then begin to stumble? Certainly, perhaps. But I know for myself, there have been instances in my life where everything seems to suddenly, all at once, be coming together, where all of the
Hmm.
frustrations and all of the toil, all of the ardent suffering suddenly begins to pay off. And just when you let your guard down, another storm comes
Right.
on the horizon. And I think that the story they're endeavoring to tell is just that Franklin is just beginning to get a handle on things, just beginning to make the progress that he's been working so hard for. And two figures who have been relatively absent from the story. And I know not whether that's because they're trying to show Franklin's isolation,
Hmm.
are Silas Dean, who
Yeah.
is Franklin's predecessor, and Arthur Lee, who are both there for the signing of the Treaty of Alliance and are both integral players. Silas Dean is in over his head completely. Franklin comes in endeavoring to clean up the mess that is made by Silas Dean.
Hmm.
And so instead, I think Franklin ends up playing the role of both Silas Dean and Franklin himself
Hmm.
because the blunders have to be there. So
Right.
some of those blunders belonged to Silas Dean over the course of the proceedings.
Interesting.
But the accounts that the American colonies or the American states are getting from France is that Franklin is holding court at Passy. He's cavorting. He's descending into lascivious behavior. He's doing everything except conducting the affairs of the infant American states. And thus, Mr. Adams' frustration, who is all pragmatism.
Right.
But of course, we've equally seen through the scope of the idle pageantry that is Franklin on Apple Plus that those things are necessary, that is the game that France plays, that is that these courtiers have nothing else better to do than to play those games.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting segue. We got a question from the chat um, that wanted to get your opinion on high fashion, and I do think that this plays into it, even in that carriage ride with Temple. How because Temple has spent some time in Versailles and court, and he has some friends there, and spends more time and was allowed to be there in a way that you were not because of your status and what it would mean if you were traipsing around Versailles. But in describing exactly the tiny little nuances of where to hold your hat, kind of things. So what do you think of all of those? Not just for the show, but just in general of that pageantry. Does it feel necessary? Is it from your perspective? Is it all pomp and or is there value in that sort of ceremony?
I think that I return once more to the opening credits because I do think them a delight. Oh, I dabbled as a printer in what you call political cartoons, and I'd
Mm.
like to think the opening credits are one long, moving political cartoon. And you see the French court adorning masks, um, and those masks are Franklin.
Mm.
Um, I think that fashion becomes the armor with which one does battle in the French court.
Interesting.
Fashion gives a depth and degree of legitimacy. Fashion shows political alliance beyond just status. In the first episode, Vergenne's wife says to wear his leopard
Mm.
um, to because she says it looks nice, but even then, fur, particularly leopard fur, is a statement of worldliness, a statement that you have access to things far beyond the reach of normal countrymen. Um, we see the French made up, and I just did an interview with a modern historic tailor, Mr. McCarty, who remarked on the universality of fashion of everyone in this time, be they indentured servant, enslaved, or kings are measured by tailors. Their
Hmm.
measurements are going to be made. What they are then going to be dressed in, the fabrics, the textiles, the buttons are going to make a statement of the wealth, affluence, and importance of that individual.
Hmm.
So if you are going to go to court, you are going to be in not only the most updated of fashions, but the things perfectly a la mode for the time, which for the French court are the powdered wigs, the rouge, the makeup, the perfect watch strings, the court sword. Everything makes a statement. Um, Fashion is bandied throughout the world. Wigs come from the time of, I believe it was uh, King Louis, who eventually allowed it through diffusion to carry to England with Charles II at his return from
Hmm.
exile. And we see the fashion bandied back and forth until America, influenced by both, begins to make their own statement and testament around this time.
Hmm.
Something I'm attributed to is the ditto suit, meaning a suit all made from the same fabric to demonstrate pragmatism. So
Right.
a suit quite literally made from all the same fabric. We see it in Franklin's red suit, a suit of ditto,
Hmm.
is what it's referred to. That plainness is a statement in and of itself. It is a counterculture rebellion to what is established, that I can stand my own in a marten fur cap and a plain coat and have it be endearing.
Right.
You understand? To suddenly have it represent the genius of American simplicity.
Sure.
Because philosophers at the time, speaking of fashion, philosophers at the time in natural science are speaking of American simplicity derisively. They're
Hmm.
speaking of the inferiority of American nature and therefore the simplicity of the American people. So Franklin taking sentiments of those like the Comte de Buffon, who Franklin knew, and saying, yes, there's simplicity, but there's far more underneath the surface because of that devotion to simplicity. And I think the notion of refusing the sword is a statement of, I could just as easily adopt these fashions,
Hmm.
not because I cannot, but because I choose not to. And
Interesting.
I think we see we see other American ministers and we will see other American ambassadors be accused of becoming Frenchified. Mr. Thomas Jefferson is a clear representative of that.
Hmm.
He comes to France unworldly and he leaves with new notions. And I do not recuse myself of the same quality. I certainly gained a lot from France, but I think, not to flatter myself, I I made an impression on France versus the other way around.
Well,
I made
to be fair to Mr. Jefferson in that instance, the you were far more solidified in your in who you were, like the stage of life that you were in when you entered this arena was very different
You make
from
a very valid point.
you know.
There is something that I had never considered before, in that Mr. Jefferson and myself both arrived to France having been recently widowed
Hmm.
from our dear beloved spouses and partners. Both of us arrived in France in time of grieving.
Yeah,
And so I think we did find something in France, both of us,
yeah,
that we did not realize we were searching for, or did not realize that we needed.
sure, yeah. Huh, that's an interesting point. I wonder if anyone has any historians have explored that, but that we'll have to pose that question, and maybe I'll put an answer in the community tab or on our socials if we do find any scholarly work on that subject in particular. We have another question from the chat here, actually from my father of all people, and I actually don't know what it means, so I'm going to read it verbatim. Was it important to be Prince Eugene, in quotes, often to have effective diplomacy, or was that a personal method of influence? I do not know what the reference to Prince Eugene is. Do you?
The reference is escaping me at
All right
present.
then. Well, it isn't surprising of my father to be obtuse. So we'll move on.
I think sometimes it's the best quality of a man.
Yeah, feel free to rephrase and re-ask. But there's I think that opulent that speaking derisively of simplicity is an interesting notion in that I think the show does a good job of sort of painting the opulence and just the amount of rules and sort of and procedures that take place in the French court and around the decision making and what that means for a leader like the king. Um, that you breaking the rules by interjecting a little bit after the I think they literally only had one sentence back and forth between the two, and then uh, Michael Douglas pipes in again to flatter the king, um, in what is sort of a breach of protocol. It looks like. Um,
I write of my first time in France, the first time I was at Versailles, and the first time I met the previous king, that on examining France, examining Paris, I had never once seen a city so opulent
hmm,
and so dirty.
interesting.
And I think the duality of the two is essential to be conveyed for this story. You have an empire in constant rivalry with Great Britain, who is bankrupting itself not only in the name of war, but also in the name of opulence.
Hmm,
And you have this opulence, this insistent devotion to tradition, to fashion, to higher ideals, coupled with a nation that, due to being ignored and neglected, is crumbling from within. So I believe it was this episode where our dear Beaumarchais is hit by a carriage.
yeah, I was actually came out of nowhere, both
Well, and
physically in the scene and also narratively because I was not expecting
well,
it.
and it's appropriate. I'm surprised. I'm surprised that it hadn't happened yet,
Okay.
because notoriously, injuries took place on the streets of Paris because carriages did not stop. It was
Hmm.
not uncommon for people to lose limbs, for children to be maimed. It was it was sheer disregard
Hmm.
for your fellow men around you. And I think that representation of turning a blind eye to the state of one's country and leaning upon the decadence that previous generations had built, that is a wonderful statement of the dangers monarchical France is facing at that
Huh.
time. And of course, I'm not undermining the fact that France will spend millions of leave assisting the United States, to the detriment of the nation, which will lead inevitably to revolution. But all the blood that follows, the reign of terror, the calamities that follow France over the next generation, are a byproduct of that insistence in leaning upon the opulence of court and the neglect of the other needs
Hmm.
of France, the other Frances that, like strata, are stacked in the same existence as the nobility.
Hmm. You took a lot more out of that scene than I did. I was um,
I'm a newspaper man, sir. I must.
happy to think about it from that perspective because it seemed like a burst of action in what is otherwise a show that doesn't have a lot of action taking place. But that is an apt metaphor. And speaking of the Reign of Terror, it did have a small bit of essentially a joke when Michael Douglas's Franklin goes to meet the Queen, Marie Antoinette, for the first time, and
Mm.
then when they make the bet, or she says what to play, she quips, "It'll be on your head if she loses," and I couldn't help but laugh
Oh,
uh, at the little knowing line of dialogue there. But they actually are playing cards in that scene, and curious of did you play cards? Was that a thing that you like to do?
cards were a great and idle pastime. The games of loo, the games of whist. Um, there are wondrous metaphors within the cards. In fact, there's a circulating article about the game of whist which makes its way through American gazettes. So in the game of whist, it's not dissimilar from your modern game of spades.
It's funny you should mention this. Someone just tried to teach me this game not even a month ago, and
you and I must get together. I shall teach you. You and I shall be corners in the game. So in the game of whist, uh, you name the suit that is going to be the trump suit. So
Okay.
in games like spades, spades are always the trump suit. But in Lou, it is cycling. Any card might be a trump suit. What is interesting about the game of whist is you have the court, you have the knave, you have the queen, you have
Mm,
the king. The trump suit, or the highest card you can play, is the simple ace. Now, what this essay says in the Gazette is that the ace is synonymous or representative of the common man, the individual.
huh.
That that kings and crowns are not the highest or those truly with power. And if that is not something tantamount to the Enlightenment and the notion of the social contract, that kings do not rule by divine right, but rather instead by the consent and power of the governed, I don't know what is. And I don't recall, I could not, in the brief time that was demonstrated, name the game that was being played
Hmm.
at the table. But cards can be a very egalitarian game and a very popular pastime. Let it be remembered that the Stamp Act, one of the items taxed for it because of its frequency, were playing cards,
Right. Yeah.
and so it was a very very popular pastime, particularly when the lights get low and it becomes difficult to read, and
Hmm.
you look for something to whittle away at those final hours before rest.
Well, I was pleasantly surprised and entertained by this episode. I think there's so we have one final question. Uh, the obfuscation has finally settled down.
Received clarification.
Yeah, well, on a different question entirely. But my father asked, did you ever write an essay on the morals of chess or chess? Like we talked about chess a little bit in the writings that you have, but I'm curious as to your relationship with the game in general.
I do not recall.
Hmm.
I don't recall.
Hmm. All right. Well, maybe we can save that for a future stream if we need to reacquaint yourself. It has been a brief 250 years since you may have written anything. So
Memories become fuzzy and need to be polished upon occasion.
yeah.
So I shall remove myself and polish my memories for the next week and return
Um,
great uh, with greater luster.
yeah, it will. It actually would be an interesting point of discussion, considering they use chess as a physical metaphor in this program so often. Yeah, we can see if there's time to get into it. But speaking of Mr. Adams and where this leaves us, are you interested to see how this how this plays out? I'm curious to see how the next episode begins. Even like, what are they going to take place?
I think we have a great foil in the relationship of Mr.
Mm,
Adams and an American power struggle. To this point, we've seen plenty of French power struggle
right.
and America vying for a seat at the table. Now we have a seat at the table, and we see a power struggle for who's going to get the seat, Dr. Franklin or Mr. Adams. And I should be an immense thorn in Mr. Adams' side. He should be an immense thorn in mine. An odder couple you cannot find.
I believe that. Oh, the one last thing that I would say, Madame Brion's husband. I love how that man is portraying that character. He is a delight every time he pops up on the screen. that drunk is very fun.
He's a bit of a caricature.
Yeah.
And I think a stand-in for all of the unnamed Frenchmen who are personifying those qualities.
He seems like he's from a different television show entirely, and I'm here for it. He's
very Dionysian.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Well, hopefully he gets featured a little bit more because it seems like there's some stuff getting mixed in with the two families here, or potentially with the two families going forward. But we will be back with you next week for the next episode. I think we'll be doing episode 5 next week. I apologize for us not doing this live stream on the normal time on Mondays. There was some scheduling conflicts. The doctor obviously is incredibly busy, but we will be back on schedule next week, I believe, and we'll notify you if plans do change. But as always, if you liked this conversation or are interested, please subscribe to the doctor's podcast. You know, he's podcasting just like the rest of us. Look at this microphone. He's getting into the game. It's called Let's Be Frank. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. And it's a fascinating dive into his life using primary sources to sort of paint a narrative and describe various moments. And the video versions of that podcast are available right on this YouTube channel. So subscribe, hit the notification bell so you get notified when new videos are dropped every Monday. And also follow our other podcast, Too Complicated for History, that I host with the wonderful Dr. Lynn Price Robbins. And if you are so inclined, feel free to support us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/primary source media. And all of the proceeds there go to support all of the content that we do, from podcasts to video. And we graciously thank all of our supporters and hope you will join them. And we also raffle off signed books on occasion, which is kind of fun. But thank you so much, Doctor, for being here. And looking forward to our conversation next week.
Your humble and obedient servant.
All right. Take care, everybody. And we are gone.